If you live in the real world, you can't do without oil. We use its byproducts every day. But the easy oil has long since been found, and world demand is ever increasing. So now oil companies must scour the ends of the earth to satisfy our thirst for fuel. This program will journey from the Amazonian jungle of Ecuador to the war-scarred savanna of Angola to see what oil does for those countries. Oil could bring blessings to the poor in the developing world. All too often, it's a curse. We are in the tropical rainforest of Ecuador. The men and women of the Guarani tribe are going fishing. Moy Enamenga is one of their leaders. He's determined that they should preserve their way of life. Moy believes that oil would be a curse to his people. He fears it will pollute the jungle, where he and his tribe have always hunted, gathered, and fished. Moy's tribe numbers about 1,500. 53,000 people work for the multinational oil giant formed by the merger of Chevron and Texaco. Headquartered in California, David O'Reilly is chairman of this $100 billion company.
Well, I've heard of the curse of oil, and I don't necessarily subscribe to it. The role that oil plays is either a positive one or a negative one because of the way countries are run, not because of the existence of oil itself.
On the far side of the Atlantic, on the west coast of Africa, these people are also fishing. They fish as they have for hundreds of years. Portuguese explorers, British and American slavers would recognize this scene in modern Angola. They are hauling in their nets within sight of Chevron Texaco's offshore oil rigs. But this oil wealth has not touched their lives. Today's catch is all they have to live on.
The wealth doesn't get distributed to some of the people that could benefit the most or need it the most. And that's clearly an issue for our industry and for our company.
We had come to the heart of Ecuador's tropical rainforest. This is the land of the Quechua people. For most of us, oil means money, and oil makes possible our modern way of life. Try telling that to the Quechua people.
decirles algo. ¿Qué es lo que quiere decir de la contaminación? Pensando de que...
Texaco first struck oil here in 1969. The government of Ecuador may have dreamed that oil would bring wealth to this poor country. But nobody consulted the Amazonian Indians, and it is they who are now paying the price of oil.
And she also said this stains the feet, this stains the children, this stains the clothes, and, you know, Texaco doesn't give us shoes to wear. I think she was saying this goes into the stream. It makes you dizzy like you're drunk.
Before, the water was clean. There were fish, there were animals, we had food to eat, yuca and banana, and we were happy living that way. We thought we would live that way forever, but the arrival of Texaco was very bad.
All of the wild animals have gone. We suffer from the smoke, the noise, and the fumes now. We can't bear it anymore. We are young, and the fumes are making us old.
When oil was first discovered in the rainforest region of Ecuador, it looked like the beginning of a beautiful friendship. The current dictator cut the ribbon. An archbishop scattered holy water. When Texaco produced its first barrel of oil, it was like a religious ritual. All too often, oil has failed to bring wealth to developing countries like Ecuador. There's little sign of oil wealth on the streets of Quito, the nation's capital. The question is, how much of this is the legal or moral responsibility of the oil industry? Fernando Villavicencio once worked for the state oil company.
Over 30 years of oil production, Ecuador has exported approximately 3,000 million barrels of oil and received $50 billion. With this money, we could have founded a new country. But it is common knowledge that the money just went. The upper classes and the multinationals took all the money. Now there are two countries here, an impoverished Ecuador and a rich Ecuador. Look down there. That's Ecuador, in poverty.
For the next chapter in this story, we headed for Ecuador's border with Colombia. Our destination was a little provincial town called Lago Agrio. It was one of the first places to find oil. Lago Agrio means bitter lake. The sun was setting by the time we reached the outskirts of the town. There's a Foreign Office advisory for business travelers and tourists. Avoid this place. Above all, don't go out after dark. The reason is the FARC guerrillas, who control the cocaine trade in southern Colombia. A lot of them go on leave in Lago Agrio. And crime, kidnapping and murder spill over the border. We were glad to pull into our hotel without incident. Next morning, plane loads of interested parties were converging on Lago Agrio. A potential $6 billion lawsuit against Texaco was about to be heard in the local court. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times and Reuters all sent correspondents to cover the first day of the Texaco trial. Today, it isn't just the world economy, but also public opinion and corporate liability that are being globalized. Cristobal Boniface is the lawyer who 10 years ago filed the lawsuit in New York on behalf of 73 local Ecuadorian plaintiffs. Steven Donziger is an American attorney assisting him on the case.
Welcome, it's great to have you here.
Fundamentally, Texaco came into this country in 1969. And this was a virgin territory, this is pristine rainforest. And they decided not to use the same precautions that are used in the United States to produce oil.
Texaco left 627 open-air pits.
The ponds are still there, the rivers are still contaminated, the roads are full of oil.
It is the worst ecological disaster in the hemisphere. It is. There's nothing like it.
What makes this trial echo around the world is that Boniface has won a landmark ruling in a US court, that if the plaintiffs win their case against Texaco in Ecuador, damages will be enforceable in America. It's a hugely important precedent, and one that could cost the oil giant billions. No wonder our hotel was overrun with lawyers, lobbyists, ecologists, and reporters.
Well, we don't like circumstances such as the Ecuador situation to occur. It's never a good thing to have a dispute going on. But in this case, we're pretty resolute.
By early morning on the first day of the trial, the courthouse was already ringed by police. Then just after sunrise, the Texaco team made its appearance. Concerned about their personal safety and a very real threat from kidnappers, they sneaked into the courtroom 2 hours before anyone else.
This is the first time in history that a giant oil company has had to come to a courthouse in a jungle town in a third world country to answer to charges that it polluted. It's never happened before today. Certainly not in a case of this magnitude, and they have tried to avoid a trial for 10 years. They have spent millions of dollars to prevent us from getting in the courthouse door.
Ricardo Vega was helping Texaco's legal team field questions from a not very friendly press.
It's easier for trial lawyers to go after companies and attack their reputation and see if they can get, multi-million-dollar settlements.
We feel we have been unfairly accused of something that we need to deal with. So we're going to be direct and forceful in asserting our rights. And while it may be unpleasant, it may be uncomfortable, we have no option but to do that.
The judge ruled he would visit some of the disputed oil pits, so we decided to take a look for ourselves. Our driver was Jorge Arroyo, who specializes in what he calls toxi tours. The edge of town was crowded with companies that supply the oil industry. At times, the paved road gave way to dirt top. Sometimes they pour oil on the dirt road to create a surface. We finally arrived at a former Texaco facility. When the security guards saw our camera, they stopped us from going any further. So Jorge took us across the road to a little house where Rosa Matango lives with her husband and children.
Buenos días.
Rosa, who is one of the plaintiffs in the Texaco trial, told us that the oil operations begun by Texaco had polluted her land and made her sick.
I
am ill. I feel like they are the lion and we are the mice. We are poor and insignificant to them.
To get to Rosa's patch of land, you have to go through the oil station. We followed her across the road, but we were not allowed in. So later that afternoon, Rosa took us round to the back of the plant and down the muddy banks of a stream. Heavy rain began to fall. She showed us how oil had soaked into the earth and how it had polluted the water. Crouching down close to the pool water, we could smell the reek of oil. We crossed the stream and got to the other side of the gorge. These are Rosa's pigs. Their backs and sides were covered in oil. Below her land is the main river.
La contaminación de parte del tiempo del Texaco, por eso está bien hondo.
The contamination began with Texaco and is now about 1 meter deep. It is deposited here, where it gathers, before flowing into the river.
Evidence of pollution was clear to see in the iridescent colors on the surface of the water. We found Hugo Oreño's house in San Carlos, across the road from what was once a Texaco facility. You have to drive over an oil pipe to get to his home. He used to work for Texaco, but now he says that oil pollution has made him too unwell to work.
Estas aguas están bastante contaminadas porque en el tiempo de que Texaco estuvo acá,
the water is contaminated because when Texaco came, they polluted. There were oil spills on the land and the roads were deliberately covered in oil. So when we used to go to town, our clothes would get covered in oil. I used to work in the southern extraction station. There were no controls.
Entonces no había ningún control.
It was Sunday in San Carlos and people were going to church. A medical survey carried out by scientists from the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in London says there's a cancer cluster here. We went to talk with the community nurse, Rosa Moreno.
My father-in-law died in 1989 of cancer of the pancreas. Then, a year and a half later, my own father died of stomach cancer. Then, my aunt died. She was young, only 53 years old. It turned out that San Carlos, with a population of 1,500 at the time, had twice as many cancer cases as the Pinchincha main province of Quito.
El cáncer estaba 2 veces más que en esta población que comparada con la población que tiene Quito, Pichincha, o sea que la capital. O sea, acá morían.
Today, we realize that we are contaminated by the oil companies.
Hoy la gente hemos hecho conciencia,
especially Texaco, and that they have caused a lot of damage.
La Texaco nos dejó haciendo mucho daño.
Texaco denies these charges.
There's no indication of any adverse health impact on the residents of the Oriente that can be linked to oil production activities, but they have a very serious problem with regard to the lack of proper hygiene and proper infrastructure, and we are sympathetic with that, but we don't accept that we are responsible for this situation.
Amateur video shot 12 years ago shows clear evidence of pollution. But can all this be blamed on Texaco? This is Sasha Central. It once belonged to Texaco. Today, it is operated by the state oil company, Petro Ecuador. The management could not or would not talk to us, but they did allow us to take pictures of the installation. The plant seemed clean and well managed. But some engineers told us that underinvestment is causing widespread pollution. They showed us machinery that was 30 years old. The firefighting equipment belonged in a museum. But Texaco ceased all operations here in 1992. Until that year, Texaco had been keen to renew its old contracts. Instead, Texaco was in effect nationalized. The government handed all its installations over to the state-owned oil company, Petroecuador. It was later agreed that Texaco would spend $40 million cleaning up some of its sites. Ricardo Vega was Texaco's project manager for the cleanup.
I spent 3 years in the jungle, and we had a certification process on a side-by-side basis. Everything that they asked us to do, we did it.
Petroecuador was supposed to assume responsibility for all other sites.
We cannot be responsible for things that Petroecuador and the government assume full responsibility for the future.
One morning, we met up with Judith Kimberling in the jungle town of Coca. Petroecuador is supposed to have cleaned up a number of Texaco's old oil pits. Judith Kimberling was going to take us to see part of that cleanup. We piled into Jorge's pickup truck and headed out into the country.
We're going to Comuna San Carlos. This is an indigenous community that's really been very seriously affected by the development that Texaco began and is now continued by Ecuador's national oil company, Petroecuador.
As we approached the village, we began to see pipelines running along the side of the road. We had arranged to meet people of the community in a large clearing here. Judith Kimmerling has been coming here for a long time.
Buenos dias. Buenos dias.
When she first asked about pollution, nobody knew what she meant.
Buenos dias.
There was no such word in their language.
Buenos dias. Buenos dias.
Judith Kimmerling teaches law in New York. She's used her professional skills to fight for the Quechua people, and she's made this a personal cause.
Buenos dias. Gracias, Yeah.
What we had come to see was an oil pit that had originally been dug by Texaco. It was supposed to have been cleaned up by Petroecuador after Texaco's contract expired. On the surface, the water looked clean enough.
Look, she just stirs it a little bit, and you can see that black crude oil from the sediments. And then when they bathe in these waters, they get skin problems. They get spots. Hongos are like mushrooms, some kind of fungus.
In the trial, Texaco blames Petroecuador for this.
¿No quiere salir? Estoy contaminada.
Como nosotros estás contaminada.
12 years ago, Kimmerling videoed a Petroecuador tractor here.
I came to this well, and there was a tractor up on this side pushing dirt onto the pit. The pit was still covered with a visible cap of crude, and the tractor just pushed dirt over it to cover it, and without removing the crude, without doing anything to isolate the contamination from the environment. And that was more than 11 years ago.
There is still a lot of contamination. We want it all cleared up. This land is useless.
Petroecuador say they are changing their environmental practices but admit there are still a few problems. We wanted to get the water analysed, so before we left, Judith Kimberlin filled 2 bottles with water from the pond.
Did you get the cap? And my hands.
Jorge drove us back to the local lab in Coca. Juan Haro Alvear supervised the tests for us. Previous results have set a troubling precedent.
Nosotros hemos trabajado en algunos tipos de investigación.
We have undertaken many experiments to determine the quality of water in this area, and we've investigated the overall impact of the oil industry.
Sea el asentamiento humano como la actividad petrolera. Bueno, como te decía,
of the pollutants we found from oil production, we've detected critical levels of heavy metals like cadmium, nickel, and lead.
Como metales pesados, cadmio, níquel y plomo.
We have found levels of total hydrocarbons that go way beyond the levels permitted.
Our sample also registered dangerous levels of hydrocarbons. When scientists from Harvard School of Public Health carried out tests of their own, they found levels of PAHs, that's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that were 40,000 times greater than what is recommended by the Environmental Protection Agency in the USA. We were back in Lago Agrio, where the Texaco trial was continuing. Outside the courthouse, things were getting lively. The demonstrators were passionate, colourful, and, this being Latin America, about an hour late. We spotted Rosa Matango in the crowd, and we also saw Rosa Moreno, who runs that clinic in San Carlos. Inside the courthouse, the judge listened for 3 hours as Texaco's lawyers read out a statement arguing that Texaco's oil pits did not break the laws of Ecuador and caused no substantial pollution.
Texaco applied international operational standards prevailing at the time we operated, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Pits did not present any lasting environmental problems with regard to impact on people or impact on the crops.
Vivid, eloquent, and passionate, the plaintiff's attorney attacked not only the legal basis, but the morality of Texaco's cleanup agreement with Ecuador's government.
That agreement frees Texaco from ever being sued by the Ecuadorian government for these damages, but it doesn't free them from being sued by the people who were affected, who had nothing at all to do with the government's decision to make this agreement, which quite frankly astounds me and is against the best interests of its own citizens.
The outcome of the trial could change the way oil companies and multinationals operate abroad forever. Because if at the end of this year the plaintiffs do win, they can recover damages in the USA. But in a global economy, world opinion is almost equally important.
People sometimes ask me why Chevron Texaco just doesn't settle this. You have protests in your shareholders' meetings. Why you just, settle and get rid of that? We can't just settle. It's because our reputation is more important than just getting rid of any political or emotional pressure.
The only language they truly understand, I have found in my experience, is the language of money and harm to reputation. And if we can expose what they've done to enough people around the world so their reputation is damaged, I believe they will reach a point where they will come to us and say, let's sit down and deal with this problem.
Whatever the outcome of the Texaco trial, oil companies are already changing their values. because it is no longer enough to simply take care of business. Based in Ecuador, Mark Thurber advises oil companies on the social and environmental impact of their operations.
What we've really seen is that the oil companies are operating under a series of new constraints. They have a lot of pressure from indigenous groups, from NGOs, from the banking community, from the Ecuadorian government to operate in a different manner than they operated in the 1970s. And the oil companies that are working here now are very interested in not repeating the mistakes that were made during that decade and trying to reduce their impacts.
Texaco is no longer pumping oil from Ecuador. It has merged with Chevron to become Chevron Texaco, the fourth biggest oil company in the world. And the way in which Chevron Texaco conducts its operations shows how oil companies are having to change. By 2015, a quarter of America's oil will come from Africa. Astounding new breakthroughs in deep water technology are making vast amounts of Angola's oil available for the first time. Chevron Texaco is a major player. It recently paid a $300 million signature bonus for the right to exploit one block. Most of the oil lies off Cabinda. Cabinda is an enclave separated from the rest of Angola by a tiny strip of the Congo. Oil was first found here when Angola and Cabinda were part of the Portuguese Empire. The colonialists left 30 years ago, but there's precious little evidence that oil wealth has trickled down to the people since then. Father Congo points out that Angola may have some of the richest oil reserves, but it remains one of Africa's poorest countries.
I was recently in Europe, and the first reaction when I said I was from Cabinda was, you're rich over there. And I said, no, we have wealth, but we're not rich. We live in apartheid. On the one hand, there's wealth, and on the other hand, there's the poverty that we live in. I can sum this up in one sentence. The people of Cabinda wake up in the morning in search of something to eat.
This is one of the hymns Father Congo writes in Fiat, the local language. The choir sings how they will go to meet God and ask Him for a good life. But according to recent reports by the widely respected charities, Catholic Relief Services and Christian Aid, the good life is still a long way away. Ironically, there's even a shortage of petrol in oil-rich Cabinda. Almost any day, there are long queues at the petrol pumps, because almost every day they run out of petrol. So where does the money go? The oil revenues are paid directly to the Angolan State Oil Company, headquartered in the nation's capital, Luanda. And you can see the evidence of the oil wealth here. You can see it, or rather you don't see it, behind the high-walled gated compounds where the 100 elite families live. You see it in the beachfront bars where expats soak up the sun. Almost everyone else lives in shantytowns, where, according to the campaign group Global Witness, 1 in 4 children die before the age of 5. Raphael Marx is an outspoken journalist sent to jail for an article called The Lipstick of Dictatorship. In it, he criticized Eduardo dos Santos, Angola's president for the last 25 years.
So this is just to see how people live in the real Rwanda. People are sort of packed up and with very basic infrastructures, no roads, no sanitation.
Desde já, agradeço a escolha. Para a tua boa informação, estás a 1400 metros de profundidade. Estás preso no lodo do petróleo bruto.
Calma, tá bem. Just look. And no sewer system, it's all open. 90% of the people live in these conditions. If we ask the oil companies, the first thing they will say is that this is none of our business. We're here to make money. Yet for them to make money, they have to support this kind of system. Chevron has been here since the 60s. Well, all these years, haven't you done business enough to care about the people from the very land you've been exploiting?
Salário da fome! Trabalho e pão! Salário da fome! Salário da fome! Salário da fome!
As we arrived in Luanda, a demonstration against poor living conditions and low wages was taking place. What fuels people's anger is an audit of Angola's oil revenues carried out by the International Monetary Fund, which showed that $4.2 billion has simply vanished into thin air. Scott Campbell works for Catholic Relief Services.
There are secrecy clauses about the payments that the oil industry gives to the government for rights to drill and extract oil. Those clauses prevent the population in Angola to know how much their government is receiving on their behalf. In the US and other Western countries, these kinds of agreements are very open and transparent. And yet overseas, these same countries, these same corporations are not signing on to transparent agreements.
When asked about this lack of transparency and the missing billions, Angola's government says, in effect, that it has lost the receipts.
This is accounting problems. Our capacity to administer is still very weak, and this is why we are getting assistance from the World Bank, from the IMF, and it will continue to be so. So there is no missing money whatsoever. There is accounting problems.
To make up for the failure of government, Chevron Texaco is now putting its own money into development schemes.
We are doing things to help the country develop, and the most recent initiative that we've pursued is when peace came, when the Civil War ended, we saw a unique opportunity to help play a role.
To see how Chevron Texaco was spending its money, we flew to Quito, in the center of Angola. For 30 years, this has been a center of conflict. There are so many unexploded mines that some foreign aid workers travel around in a Casper. It's a South African-made armoured personnel carrier that is supposed to protect its passengers from landmines. It's still dangerous here. 5 months before we came here, 6 aid workers were blown up and killed. Driving into Quito, you find yourself entering a kind of African Stalingrad. Anti-government rebels laid siege to this place for a year and a half. It was, of course, oil that made Angola worth fighting for, and it was oil that enabled the government to buy the mines and the weapons that prolonged that war. On our way into town, we turned off the main road. And this is where we found Halo. The mission of this small British charity is to clear mines and unexploded ordnance. In the backyard, men were painting rocks red. They're used to mark minefields that are still active. We saw plenty of these in the next few days. On the edge of town, we found ourselves on a dirt road, driving through elephant grass. And then we saw the tanks up ahead.
Is this where you're clearing is going on now? Oh my God, look at that.
They had been rebel tanks. You could see how it had happened. The lead tank had run into a mine. The next two tanks swerved off the road to avoid the mines, but they had fallen for the trap. Now a team from Halo was clearing the mines. They showed us how the minefield covered more than 100 yards.
Do primeiro até o terceiro.
We followed Alexander Batten and his Angolan colleague, Gabriel Marx, into the field.
This is where we would have destroyed an AT mine, quite a big hole. So we're now entering the current task. Red and white sticks indicate the perimeter. The uncleared areas are to the left and to the right, where we haven't cut the vegetation is uncleared. Very dense minefield. Here, around in this area, people will come in here and collect wood and cultivate the land, and they can often be injured by hitting mines or just walking on them. When there is an accident, people obviously will be very fearful of going anywhere near where that accident occurred. So whether there are mines there or not, people will not use that area. It will prevent them from cultivating the land.
They never claim to clear a minefield completely. They prefer to say they have reduced the threat.
Mines are such a curse because whether they are in the ground or whether there's the fear of them in the ground, they just completely stop a community from developing, stop a whole country from developing.
They will, link the detonator to the explosive.
We were surprised that no oil money is finding its way to mine-clearing charities like Halo. We were 100 yards away when they detonated the mines, but we could still feel the blast. Our journey to the development projects funded by Chevron Texaco started at the headquarters of CARE International. To protect us from landmines, our four-wheel drive had armour plating underneath it. Kenneth Chimwazo was going to show us some CARE projects that the oil companies are funding.
In the next 2 days, we are going to see some of these projects funded by, oil companies, carried out by CARE International.
Like everyone here, Ken has a story. And like most such stories, it's a sad one. Forced to flee the conflict in Angola, he lived in a refugee camp in neighbouring Zambia for 27 years. He returned to Angola when the war ended, but his wife and children still live in Zambia. He misses them terribly. Today, he was very worried about one of his sons who was sick in hospital thousands of miles away. If oil money can help heal Angola's wounds, Ken's family may be able to reunite one day.
The oil companies are here, so they have to see Angola develop. And they are very much interested in agriculture activities because it's the backbone of the nation.
The road wasn't just terrible. In some places, it was completely impassable. And this is what led us to the first of the oil-funded development projects. At first glance, it looked like a food handout.
Here we are witnessing the distribution of food for work. These people, they worked on the road. You know, the road was impassable. So today they are receiving maize, beans, and cooking oil. They are receiving the food for the work that they have done.
So, this was no handout. Gangs of local villagers had been shifting stones to fix this dirt road. The food was payment for their work, and the work should lead to even better things. Because when the road is repaired, the villagers will be able to get their food to market.
These people you see here, they are harvesting a field of an association.
The oil companies say they don't want their money to create dependence. The idea is to invest in schemes that will, quite literally, keep growing.
Care and the oil companies gave tools, animals to work on the fields, plows, hoes, machetes, sharpening files, and axes to the farmers in the association here.
Before they received this aid, a farmer from here was lucky to grow 3 bags of maize a year.
This farmer, this time, he has produced, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 bags of maize, you know, maize, and almost one bag of beans, and 4 bags of groundnuts. Part of the food is sold so that they can sustain their livelihood, you know, maybe money for medication, school for their children, and, you know, the other bags remain for consumption, of course.
The hope is that a series of small steps will lead in the end to long-term development. Chevron Texaco believes that the best long-term investment it can make is in human capital. Ricky Veilholm works for the Danish charity ADPP. She had travelled with us to Cabinda.
Today we are going to a school which are training teachers of the future.
On our way, we passed the Chevron Texaco compound. It's ringed with barbed wire and fences and, incredibly, landmines planted by the government, but still not cleared. Ricky Veilholm thinks this teacher training college symbolises the new approach that oil companies are taking.
I don't know if it is off the record or what, but it's said as a slogan, don't bribe a single person, bribe the whole nation, in a good sense of bribing. Because if you can actually manage to make good things for the whole nation, it's much better for your business.
Natasha Kwakwa is a young British volunteer.
This is one of the very few primary schools in the area. Our students are here doing their school practice, and through this practice they are learning how to work with the children for the very first time. So effectively you could say this is an example of how oil companies are creating sustainable development in Angola, because our students are being funded by these oil companies to be better teachers for these primary school children.
After 2 years in the teacher training college, students are sent out into the country to teach in village schools. They stay there for a year. They like to say that one of these teachers will need 2 heads, one for the classroom and one for the community.
And it's part of getting the certificate that you have 2 heads. So don't come here and only have 1. You have 2.
Yeah, we have a lot of projects. At this moment, we're trying to dig a hole. So with this hole, We're going to build a small work closet.
In this village, another teacher is trying to grow pineapples, while another is organising a football field. Chevron Texaco is committing $25 million to projects like these. They call it an investment in the future.
I think of it as good for business. We are a major investor in Angola. It is good for our investments and for our future growth there to have a country that is stable, that is growing, that has an improved education system, that has better health care. Maybe there's a tinge of idealism in there because this is something that hasn't been tried before, to my knowledge. And we're proud to be part of that.
But according to Chevron Texaco's critics, $25 million is peanuts when lack of transparency in government accounting allows $4.2 billion in oil revenue to vanish without a trace.
Catholic Relief Services did not accept money from Chevron Texaco because we wanted to be very free and at liberty to pursue our advocacy campaign for transparency.
We support transparency. Periodically, we see frustration at the local population level that is of concern to us, and one of the reasons why we believe that good governance and good institutions and transparency is good for our industry.
For all their power and wealth, these oil giants can be surprisingly vulnerable to government pressure. When BP offered to open its books, the government of Angola told it in effect to shut up or get out.
A few years ago, BP announced the oil revenues it gave to the government, and in short order, the government came back to them and said, absolutely, you must stop that immediately. Obrigado.
We too were forced to stop when police saw us filming on a public beach. A small taste of how Angolans are kept in the dark. It was our last night in Luanda. Time to reflect on our journey from Ecuador to Angola, in which we saw how oil companies are having to bow to the spirit of the time. Texaco's landmark lawsuit in Ecuador is symptomatic of the moral, political and environmental pressures which are forcing them to change. Outside a gas station across the road, we spotted some street kids. Like their American hip-hop idols, they love to rap. About oil and poverty, about government and corruption. Boys like Fernando, Nandinho and Joao wash windscreens by day, sleep rough by night. And when they want to get high, they sniff petrol.
You can see the next part of The Curse of Oil tomorrow at 1:30 here on BBC4. But stay with us now as we remember the discoveries of Tutankhamun's tomb and the Rosetta Stone. Days That Shook the World is next.
We had come to the heart of Ecuador's tropical rainforest. This is the land of the Quechua people. For most of us, oil means money, and oil makes possible our modern way of life. Try telling that to the Quechua people.
decirles algo. ¿Qué es lo que quiere decir de la contaminación? Pensando de que...
Texaco first struck oil here in 1969. The government of Ecuador may have dreamed that oil would bring wealth to this poor country. But nobody consulted the Amazon. We are in the tropical rainforest of Ecuador. The men and women of the Guarani tribe are going fishing. Moy Enamenga is one of their leaders. He's determined that they should preserve their way of life. If you live in the real world, you can't do without oil. We use its byproducts every day. But the easy oil has long since been found, and world demand is ever increasing. So now oil companies must scour the ends of the earth to satisfy our thirst for fuel. This program will journey from the Amazonian jungle of Ecuador to the war-scarred savanna of Angola to see what oil does for those countries. Oil could bring blessings to the poor in the developing world. All too often, it's a curse. Portuguese explorers, British and American slavers would recognize this scene in modern Angola. They are hauling in their nets within sight of Chevron Texaco's offshore oil rigs. But this oil wealth has not touched their lives. Today's catch is all they have to live on.
The wealth doesn't get distributed to some of the people that could benefit the most or need it the most. And that's clearly an issue for our industry and for our company.
Moy believes that oil would be a curse to his people. He fears it will pollute the jungle where he and his tribe have always hunted, gathered and fished. Moy's tribe numbers about 1,500. 53,000 people work for the multinational oil giant formed by the merger of Chevron and Texaco. Headquartered in California, David O'Reilly is chairman of this $100 billion company.
Well, I've heard of the curse of oil, and I don't necessarily subscribe to it. The role that oil plays is either a positive one or a negative one because of the way countries are run, not because of the existence of oil itself.
On the far side of the Atlantic, on the west coast of Africa, these people are also fishing. They fish as they have for hundreds of years.